The desert sun bled into the horizon, a crimson fire spilling across the sky as the day surrendered to twilight. Heat still clung to the earth, the kind that rose in waves from the dirt and pressed against every breath, but the air carried a sharpness, a whisper of evening that promised a softer touch. In that raw edge between day and night, the world seemed to pause, holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for someone. Dust drifted across the trading yard, golden motes suspended in fading light, and the murmurs of men filled the silence where compassion should have lived. At the center of the yard, a girl stood bound, her wrists rubbed raw by coarse rope, her dress torn in too many places to offer modesty, and her dark hair falling like a curtain to hide bruises scattered across her skin. She was not a spectacle. She was a wound dressed as flesh. Yet the crowd, drawn by cruelty like moths to flame, treated her as entertainment. Coins clinked in pockets. Men muttered and spat. Laughter tore through the air like jagged glass. $2, that was the price set upon her, as if the worth of her soul could be reduced to metal cold enough to slip from hand to hand. No one stepped forward. No one claimed her, not out of mercy, but because she was deemed too little, too broken, too dangerous. In that moment, she became both invisible and painfully exposed, a contradiction only the desperate know. Her silence was not choice, but survival. Her lowered gaze not submission, but armor. She stood there, swaying against the pull of the rope, while men measured her life against their appetites and found it lacking. And still the desert watched. The wind slipped between wagons and stirred her hair across her cheek, as if nature itself tried to soothe what man had torn apart. Somewhere inside, her heart whispered a prayer, not for rescue, for she no longer believed in such things, but for endurance, for the healing gift of one more breath and then another. Each inhale became an act of defiance, each heartbeat a reminder she was still alive, even if the world had priced her so cheap. At the far edge of the yard, a figure lingered, broad-shouldered, dust clinging to his hat, a scar etched across his cheek like history carved into stone. He did not join in the laughter. He did not look away. His stillness held weight, the kind of weight that comes from years of carrying ghosts no one else can see. He stood as though the cruelty before him were not new, as though he had walked through darker places and vowed never to let them claim him again. His silence did not echo the crowd's indifference. It carried the storm of a decision unspoken. The girl did not see him yet, not fully, but she felt it. The shift in the air, the way the noise of jeering men dulled beneath the quiet gravity of one gaze. She could not name it, but for the first time since the rope was tied, her chest eased enough to draw breath without choking on despair. Moments like these are where stories are born. Not in grand declarations, not in noble speeches, but in the stillness of someone refusing to walk away. For when one soul chooses to see another, truly see them beyond the dust, beyond the bruises, beyond the worth the world has assigned, something fragile yet unbreakable begins. And perhaps that is why you are here, listening now, because you too believe in the quiet power of choices. If this story brings even a flicker of light to your heart, if it heals some hidden ache or reminds you of the beauty of compassion, let your support breathe life into it. A like, a comment, a small subscription. These are not just gestures, they are threads that weave us together across distance, creating a family of listeners who believe in love's redemptive fire. Your presence here matters more than you know. The girl's rope tugged once more, a cruel hand pulling her forward, and the crowd jeered louder, as though volume could drown out humanity. She stumbled, knees striking dirt, but she rose again, trembling, determined not to break in front of them. In that stubborn rise, in that fractured dignity, she carried the seed of a story greater than the chains around her wrists. And on the other side of the yard, the cowboy's hand brushed against 2 silver coins in his pocket. He had meant them for nails and lamp oil, but perhaps they had always been meant for something else, something that would change not only her life, but his as well. The desert night deepened, and with it the weight of choice pressed upon him. Soon the silence would shatter. Soon the first step of a journey neither of them expected would begin. The coins clinked as they fell into the ranch hand's filthy palm, a sound sharp enough to cut through the drunken jeers and the muttering of the crowd. 2 silver dollars shining against the grime of fingers that had known nothing but greed. The man's grin split wide, ugly and triumphant, as if cruelty had finally paid him in kind. But the cowboy's face stayed carved in silence. He was not there for bargain, nor for ownership. He was there to end something that should never have begun. His hand moved, steady, sure, pulling the knife from his belt. The girl flinched, her breath catching, her heart hammering against the cage of her ribs. For one sickening instant, she believed she had merely been traded from one torment to another. The blade glinted in the last spill of sunlight, sharp enough to cut bone, and her body recoiled against the air, too weak to fight, but too proud to beg. Yet the knife never turned against her. Instead, with one firm stroke, it severed the rope binding her wrists. The rough strands fell away, leaving angry welts across her skin, but also leaving her hands her own once more. She blinked at the sudden weightlessness, the absence of pain biting into her flesh. For so long, rope had been certainty, chain had been truth. Freedom felt like a trick, too fragile to believe in. Her gaze flickered up, not daring to meet his eyes, but enough to see the blade slide back into its sheath. No grasping hands, no cruel order, only silence and space. It was the smallest act, yet it healed more than any bandage could. It reminded her she was not an object to be bound, but a person who could stand without tether. The crowd shifted uneasily, their entertainment stolen, their cowardice reflected in the man who had chosen not to be one of them. One by one they turned away, muttering about trouble, spitting into the dust, pretending the moment had not unsettled something within them. The ranch hand, coins clutched greedily, stumbled off toward the saloon, already forgetting the woman he had paraded like livestock. Soon the yard was empty, save for dust curling in the twilight and 2 figures standing in the silence left behind. He did not ask her name. He did not demand her story. He simply extended a steady hand to her elbow, guiding her toward the mule tethered near the edge of the yard. His grip was firm, but not cruel, guiding, not pulling. She wanted to resist, to lash out with the little strength left, but her body betrayed her. Exhaustion pressed heavy on her shoulders, bruises ached with each step, and so she let him lead. Each movement carried an unfamiliar gentleness, and that gentleness was more disarming than any blade. When he lifted her onto the mule, she braced for roughness, but found only care. His hands were careful, mindful of the ribs hidden beneath torn cloth. For years she had been handled like burden, like property, yet in his silence there was something different, something that did not take, but offered. She sat unsteady on the mule's back, gripping the saddle horn with trembling fingers, and told herself to keep breathing. The air tasted different, lighter somehow, though her fear had not yet loosened its hold. The road stretched north, winding into hills washed in the last glow of sun. Shadows grew long, cool wind stirring sage and dry grass, carrying the desert's perfume into the evening. He walked beside the mule, reins in his hand, each step measured and calm. He did not speak, and neither did she. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. Two people burdened by scars too deep for words, moving side by side without yet knowing where the path would lead. She stole glances at his shoulders, broad and steady beneath the dust-stained coat, at the scar cutting across his cheek, a mark of battles she could not yet imagine. His presence unsettled her, not with fear, but with something she had forgotten, safety, fragile as a flame against wind. She clung to it despite herself, because for the first time since memory allowed, she was not waiting for the next blow. The mule climbed slowly, hooves pressing into pale soil that glowed faintly beneath the moon's rise. At last, a cabin came into sight, crouched against the ridge like a guardian of solitude. Smoke curled weak from a stovepipe, and a faint fence stretched around a pair of cows in the corral. It was not much, yet to her eyes accustomed to cages and dirt, it was more than enough. It was walls that held no crowd, a roof that promised shelter. He helped her down, his hands steady at her sides, and stepped back quickly as though afraid of overstepping. She swayed, legs trembling, and for a moment her gaze flicked to the cabin door, uncertainty tearing through her. Was this another prison? Another set of walls meant to bind her? He seemed to sense her hesitation, for when he opened the door, he stood aside, voice low, almost an invitation. Inside. The room smelled of wood smoke and old coffee. A bed against the far wall, a table scarred by years of use, a rifle in the corner. It was not the dwelling of a man who expected company. She lingered at the threshold, her body taut as wire, but the memory of jeering men pressed her forward. Between the cabin walls and the empty desert, she chose the walls. He placed a folded shirt and bar of soap on the bed without looking at her, then busied himself with the stove. For long moments she studied him, waiting for the demand that would surely come. Her heart drummed hard against her chest, each beat a warning. But the demand never came. His back remained turned, his voice plain but gentle. You can wash. I'll stay put. It was such a simple thing. Privacy. Yet to her it felt like a gift greater than gold, a healing salve for wounds carved deep into spirit. Her hands trembled as she touched the coarse cotton of the shirt, as though expecting it to vanish. But it did not vanish. It waited for her, a quiet offering. She washed, the basin water stinging against cuts and bruises, peeling away layers of dirt and blood. When she pulled the shirt over her frame, loose and long enough to cover her, she felt the first hint of dignity return. It was not beauty, not transformation, but it was hers. She folded the torn dress into a bundle, the fabric heavy with shame and memory, and laid it aside. For the first time in too many nights, She did not feel eyes on her body. When she turned, he sat by the fire, hat tipped low, his scar faint in the glow. He did not watch her, did not press, only spoke softly. "Get some rest. You'll need it." The blanket on the bed was rough, but warm. She pulled it close, her body stiff, waiting for footsteps, waiting for the inevitable hand. None came. She heard only the creak of his chair, the quiet shift of boots by the fire. Her breath steadied. Her heart slowed. In that silence, she discovered something she had long forgotten, the beginning of peace. Fragile, like the first sprout pushing through hard soil, but alive nonetheless. Sleep came to her gently, a healing she had not dared hope for. And as she drifted, the cowboy kept watch in the firelight. A man who had chosen to carry her safety as if it were his own burden. Outside, the desert whispered in the cool night air, and inside the cabin the seeds of trust lay quietly in the dark, waiting for the dawn. Morning light crept into the cabin in pale stripes, slipping through the cracks in the shutters and painting the floor with quiet patterns. The stove had burned down to faint embers, the air cool enough that each breath rose in soft mist. She stirred beneath the blanket, her body stiff from bruises, but warmer than it had been in weeks. For a heartbeat, panic seized her. Walls, a bed, the smell of wood smoke, and her chest tightened as memory surged. Then her eyes fell upon him. He sat near the stove, his boots planted firm, his chair tilted slightly back, his face turned toward the faint glow of the coals. He had not moved close in the night. He had not reached for her. He had only kept vigil. The tension in her shoulders eased. She pulled the cotton shirt tighter around her frame, still half expecting his gaze to turn sharp, but his eyes remained on the stove. He moved with unhurried steadiness, pouring water into a kettle, slicing bread from a tin, placing it on a plate with care that seemed too deliberate for a man who lived alone. When at last he gestured for her to sit, his voice was plain, steady, without command. "There's bread. Coffee soon." The words carried no edge, only fact. She crossed the room slowly, her bare feet whispering against the wooden floor, and lowered herself into the chair across from him. Her hands shook as she reached for the bread, not from hunger alone, but from nerves. Every man she had known had wanted something. Silence had always been the moment before a demand. Yet this silence was different. It was heavy, yes, but not sharp. It wrapped around them like a blanket, unfamiliar, but almost soothing. He ate his own bread without comment, giving her space to chew in small, hesitant bites. The warmth of food spread through her chest like medicine, healing not just hunger, but something deeper, something hollow that had ached for too long. After a while, he broke the silence with words so simple she almost thought she had misheard. "You'll need a dress that fits. That one's no good anymore." His eyes flicked briefly to the bundle of torn fabric folded near the bed. "I'll ride to town later in the week." He spoke of it not as transaction, not as condition, but as if it were settled fact, a practical need, nothing more. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had not expected him to notice, much less to speak of it with such calm. Her heart pushed the question to her lips before she could stop it. "Why did you pay?" The words rasped from disuse, her voice rough, uncertain. trembling like a bird taking flight for the first time. He paused, setting down his coffee cup. For the first time since she had stepped into the cabin, his eyes met hers, steady, not hard, scar glinting faintly in the morning light. Because leaving you there would have been wrong. $2 didn't matter. You did. He left it at that. No embellishment, no explanation, no demand for gratitude. Truth laid bare, plain and undeniable. Her gaze dropped, overwhelmed by the weight of his answer. It was too direct to be a trick, too unpolished to be anything but real. Something shifted inside her, fragile but certain, a thread of trust weaving into the fabric of her heart. She did not thank him. Words like that felt too small, too hollow. But she held the truth of his words like a stone in her palm, something solid to cling to. Later that day, he carried in wood for the stove, stacking it neatly by the wall. She noticed a tear in the lining of his coat, the fabric worn and fraying. Without asking, her hands moved toward the small chest where needle and thread rested. She had not chosen anything in months, not her steps, not her words, not her silence. Yet now, quietly, she chose. She sat by the table and began stitching the coat with practiced care. He paused in the middle of setting down the logs, watching her for a long moment. His lips did not curve, his voice did not rise, but inside his chest something eased. It was the first time she had acted on her own since entering his world. He said nothing, only returned to his work, but the silence between them warmed. That night the fire burned high, filling the cabin with a golden glow. She sat at the table, the mended coat folded neatly beside her, her hands resting in her lap. He sat across from her, sharpening his knife with slow, rhythmic strokes. The sound filled the air between them, steady, grounding. She thought of his words that morning, of the way he had not demanded, not pressed, only offered truth. She felt a tug inside her, a need to give something back. Her voice broke the silence, quiet but clear. "My name." She paused, her chest tightening with old fear, but she pressed on. "Sa." Speaking it aloud felt like peeling back armor, laying herself bare. Names had been stolen, twisted, used against her. But here, in this cabin, with his scar catching the firelight, she gave it freely. He looked up from his knife. His lips shaped the word once. Steady. "Sa." Then he nodded, as if that alone was enough. He did not press her for more, did not ask where she came from, what had been done to her, or who she had lost. He accepted the gift of her name as though it was all she needed to give. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt herself seen, not as a body, not as a burden, but as a person. That night, when she lay beneath the blanket, the fire glowing low, she closed her eyes, not in fear of footsteps, but in fragile calm. Sleep came slowly, not out of exhaustion, but out of safety. The kind of sleep that heals, the kind that restores what cruelty had tried to steal. And across the room, the cowboy sat in his chair, eyes half shut, ears still sharp, guarding the silence they had built together. Outside, the desert stretched endless and wild, yet inside the cabin, something had begun to take root. Not trust yet, not love, but the beginning of both. The night deepened, carrying them toward days neither yet understood, where silence would grow into words, and words into choices that would bind them together in ways the world had not foreseen. The days that followed folded into a rhythm, slow and steady, like the desert wind threading between the cottonwoods. The cabin became more than walls of pine logs. It became a place where silence softened into something almost tender. Ethan split wood outside, the steady swing of his axe echoing through the valley, while Saar fed the fire, stirred beans, and stitched torn cloth with quiet hands. Neither asked for more than the other could give, yet in those unspoken exchanges a fragile kind of harmony grew. Every act became a thread in the tapestry they were weaving without realizing. When she mended his coat, he noticed how her shoulders straightened, as though the needle and thread gave her back a piece of control the world had stolen. When he laid another blanket over her at night, she no longer flinched, but pulled it closer, her breathing falling into easier rhythm. Healing came not as a sudden miracle, but in increments, small as drops of water shaping stone, patient and enduring. It was during one of those evenings, the fire crackling low, that she allowed herself to hum. The sound slipped from her lips without thought, a tune carried from her people, low, haunting, yet soft enough to cradle memory instead of sharpen grief. Ethan did not ask what it meant, though he heard every note. He only sat in his chair, sharpening his knife, letting her voice wrap around the cabin like a balm. In his chest, the hollow place carved by war and solitude eased for the first time in years. Trust was no longer a distant dream. It revealed itself in gestures so small they might have been missed. The way she set his repaired coat on the chair before he returned from hauling water, the way his hand lingered just a second longer when passing her a plate, the way they could sit together without words and yet not feel alone. The quiet between them was no longer a burden. It was a shelter. But healing is never a straight path. At night, the shadows still pressed on her chest. She woke sometimes with sweat on her skin, her breath ragged, memories dragging her back to rope and jeers. In those moments the dark became too heavy to bear. Ethan would not crowd her, would not force comfort upon her. Instead, his chair creaked softly, and his voice, low and steady, crossed the room. "You're all right. You're safe here." The words were not adorned, not coaxing. They were plain as the desert itself, and because of that, they were true. One night, her fear refused to yield. She trembled beneath the blanket, her throat tight with unshed cries. Ethan rose quietly, stopping at the edge of the bed, waiting for her choice. She reached out, fingers shaking, and placed her hand over his. "Stay," she whispered. His weight sank onto the mattress, careful, his hand resting atop the blanket at her waist. He asked for nothing more, moved no closer, but gave her his presence as anchor. Her breathing steadied, her heart settling against the rhythm of his stillness. The healing that touched her then was not the absence of fear, but the presence of someone willing to hold it with her. In time, that presence turned into something deeper. One night, with the fire burning down to embers, her hand found his, their fingers aligning like puzzle pieces shaped by separate storms but meant to fit. She turned toward him, forehead brushing his shoulder, and for the first time their lips met, hesitant, unpolished, but real. It was not hunger, not demand, but a choice, fragile and beautiful. No coins, no rope, no command, just two wounded souls meeting in trust. The kiss was not the culmination of their story, but the seed of it, planted in soil watered by patience. The morning after, nothing was spoken of it, yet everything had changed. She moved through the cabin lighter, shoulders less guarded, eyes clearer. He carried himself with the same quiet gravity, but the air between them hummed differently now, charged with the knowledge that they had crossed into something new. Their silence carried warmth, no longer waiting, no longer uncertain. And when they stepped outside into the sharp air of dawn, the ridge glowing gold beneath the rising sun, Sa realized that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wanted to stay. Not because she had no other place, but because this was where her spirit felt less broken, where healing had begun to take root. The cabin, once only his refuge, had become theirs. And though the desert stretched wide with dangers yet to come, she knew with quiet certainty that whatever storms lay ahead, they would not face them apart. The path of survival had shifted into the path of belonging, and step by step, choice by choice, they were walking it together. The morning came with the weight of necessity. The flour sack lay nearly empty, the coffee tin scraped for its last spoonful, and the salt barrel echoed hollow when touched. Ethan knew from the first day this moment would arrive. Supplies were life, and life demanded the courage to face places both of them wished to avoid. He told her quietly the night before, his voice carrying its usual calm finality. They would ride to town at dawn. His words were not command, not request, but truth, spoken as steady as the ground beneath their boots. Sa's chest had tightened at the thought. The memory of the trading yard lived sharp within her, rope biting into her wrists, laughter thrown like stones, eyes stripping her of dignity. But she nodded anyway. Survival left no room for hesitation. She promised herself she would walk beside him, not behind. She was no longer the woman dragged into the dirt. She had a name, a voice, and the faint but growing strength of choice. At dawn, Ethan saddled his gelding, tied the empty flour sack to the horn, and helped her onto the mule. He offered a wool shawl he had found in his chest, plain but serviceable. "Wind'll bite," he said simply. She wrapped it tightly, grateful for its warmth, and for the way it shielded her from the memory of the ragged dress she had burned days earlier. That act, feeding it to the fire, had been more than necessity. It had been a burial. The trail wound through pale earth, the desert stretching wide and endless, sage carrying the scent of rain that had not yet come. Ethan walked close to her side, his limp evident in the rhythm of his steps, but his stride steady. She watched the way his shoulders bore the weight of silence, how the brim of his hat shielded his eyes but never his watchfulness. She found comfort in that steadiness. For the first time since her capture, she did not feel like prey waiting to be struck. She was part of a pair moving forward, scarred but unbroken. As the town came into sight, her stomach knotted. Smoke rose from chimneys, wagons rattled over boards, voices of men rang out in careless laughter. The mule shifted beneath her, sensing her tension. Ethan reached up, steadying the reins with a touch that told her, without words, "You are not alone here." They tied up outside the general store. Already eyes turned. A ranch hand leaned against the post, whispering into another's ear, his gaze narrowing on her. Two women paused mid-step, one tugging the other along with quickened strides, baskets pressed close to their chests. Every stare pressed into her skin like old bruises. Shame surged, thick and bitter, but Ethan stepped down first and held out his hand. His eyes, when she met them, carried no mockery, no command, only steady expectation. Her fingers trembled, but she placed her hand in his, letting him guide her down. At his side, she straightened her shoulders. If they saw her, they would see her standing beside him, not broken, not owned. Inside, the air smelled of leather and flour, the shelves lined with tins of beans and bolts of cloth. The storekeeper looked up from his ledger and froze, just for a heartbeat too long, before clearing his throat. Ethan's voice cut through the silence, calm, low, certain. Need flour, coffee, salt. A bolt of cloth, blue, if you have it. Boots, women's size 6. His words carried no hesitation, no allowance for insult. He named what she needed as though her needs were fact, not favor. Her breath caught. He had noticed her feet. Bare that day she crossed his cabin floor, measured them without asking. The detail startled her, not because it was invasive, but because it was care disguised in practicality. She held the shawl tighter, hiding the way her chest swelled with something unfamiliar, something like worth. The door banged open, and the ranch hand who had once dragged her by rope stumbled in, whiskey stench thick even in the morning. His lip curled when his eyes fell on her, then shifted to Ethan with a sneer. "Thought I got rid of that problem. Didn't figure you for the type to waste good coin." Her stomach twisted, the memory flooding back, his grip, the dirt, the spit. For a moment, she felt her body freeze, as though the rope still bound her wrists. Ethan stepped forward, his shadow cutting between her and the man, voice even but firm. "You took your money. That was the end of it. Leave it there." The ranch hand spat on the floorboards, voice dripping venom. "She'll bring you nothing but trouble." Ethan's gaze did not waver. "Then it'll be my trouble." His tone left no space for argument. It was not loud, not aggressive. It was final. The storekeeper returned with supplies, his hands trembling slightly as he set them on the counter. The ranch hand muttered curses and stomped back into the street, his shadow shrinking against the glare of sun. Sa released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her fingers trembling as she clutched the shawl. Ethan paid without comment, gathered the goods, and guided her outside. As he loaded the mule, he leaned close, his voice low enough for her alone. "You're safe with me. They can look, but they can't take you." She swallowed hard, nodding. The words did not erase the fear, but they steadied her. For the first time since the yard, she believed she might not have to face the world's cruelty alone. They rode out of town slowly, the weight of stairs fading with each mile, dust rising behind them. Sa sat taller in the saddle, her grip less desperate, her shoulders straighter. Ethan rode close, his silence no longer heavy but protective. She realized now why people respected his quiet words, because when he spoke, he meant them. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun had burned low and shadows stretched long across the ridge. Sa carried the bolt of blue cloth to the table, running her fingers across its smooth surface. It was hers, not given in mockery, not bought with shame, but chosen with care. She traced the edge as though anchoring herself to something real, something healing. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt the fragile root of belonging press into her chest. The cabin glowed with the firelight, the desert hushed beyond the walls, and though danger lingered in memory and in whispers that would not easily fade, Sa knew with quiet certainty that this was no longer just Ethan's refuge. It was becoming theirs, a place where pain softened into healing, where silence transformed into trust, and where two lives, scarred and weary, began to weave together into something stronger than either had dared believe. The days after their return to the cabin settled into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like the beginning of a life. The shelves were no longer bare, the bolt of blue cloth folded neatly on the table until Sa's hands cut and stitched it into something whole. Each measured thread carried with it a quiet reclamation of self, every stitch an act of healing. The torn dress she had once worn had already been reduced to ash in the fire pit, its smoke spiraling into the sky like a farewell to the shame it carried. In its place, the fabric of her choosing began to take shape, draped not in memory but in possibility. Ethan split wood outside, his axe striking steady as his breath, while Sa hummed softly by the fire, her song weaving through the cabin like balm. He never asked what the tune meant. He only listened, letting her melody fill the space that once held only silence and ghosts. When she believed he wasn't paying attention, he found his chest easing, his burden lightened by something as small and profound as her voice. In those quiet days, the trust between them deepened in small, almost invisible ways. She no longer waited for his approval before placing food on the table. She no longer stiffened when his hand brushed hers as he passed a plate. And when he laid a blanket over her shoulders on a chill night, she gathered it closer around herself with no flinch, only gratitude. Healing was not sudden. It was layered, woven patiently through days of presence. But healing does not come without the ghosts of the past pressing against it. At night, fear still crept into her chest. She woke with sweat on her skin, breath caught in her throat, her body trembling as memory dragged her back to the yard. Ethan heard her every time. He did not come rushing, did not startle her with sudden touch. Instead, his chair creaked softly in the dark, and his voice reached her like a rope thrown across a river. "You're all right. You're safe here." The words were plain, unadorned, but they steadied her. She would clutch the blanket until her hands cramped, then finally let out a breath and allow sleep to return. One night, the storm inside her refused to relent. Her chest heaved, her body rigid with panic. Ethan rose from his chair, moving slow, deliberate, until he stood at the edge of the bed. He did not lean close. He waited. Her hand, trembling but determined, reached for his. "Stay," she whispered, her voice breaking. He sat down carefully, the mattress dipping with his weight, and rested his hand over hers. He made no move to claim, no motion to crowd, only stayed exactly where she needed him. Her breathing steadied against the rhythm of his stillness, the terror finally loosening its hold. Healing came not because the nightmares vanished, but because she no longer faced them alone. That night, as the fire burned low, she turned toward him, her forehead brushing against his shoulder. He bent his head, pressing a hesitant kiss to her hair, his lips lingering just long enough to tell her without words that she was more than survival to him. She tilted her face upward, her cheek brushing against his scar, and then their lips met. It was not rushed, not demanded, but chosen, soft, uncertain, the kind of kiss that carried both fragility and promise. It was the beginning of something new, born not from ownership, not from debt, but from choice. When dawn returned, nothing was spoken of the kiss, yet everything had changed. The air between them hummed with new weight, warm and steady. Sa moved through the cabin with shoulders less guarded, her eyes brighter, her silence carrying not fear, but ease. Ethan carried the same quiet gravity as always, but his gaze lingered on her with a softness he did not try to hide. Their silence no longer bore the ache of loneliness. It was a sanctuary where two broken souls had found the courage to meet. Days stretched into weeks, the cabin echoing not with emptiness, but with life. Sa worked the soil behind the corral, planting beans and squash, her hands raw, but her spirit lifted by the earth's promise of growth. Ethan mended fences, his limp slowing him, yet his persistence unwavering. She found herself watching him sometimes, the set of his shoulders, the way he never complained of pain, only endured. Once he caught her gaze and offered the faintest smile, small, fleeting, but it startled her. It was the first time she had seen his face bend with something lighter than duty. That single smile was a healing in itself, proof that even scars could bend toward warmth. One evening, as rain rolled sudden and fierce from the horizon, they hammered canvas over the cabin roof together, water streaming down their faces. Her hair clung wet to her cheeks, her arms ached from gripping the hammer, but she did not falter. Beside him, she felt her strength match his. When they finally ducked inside, dripping and breathless, they stood by the fire, steam rising from their clothes, their eyes meeting not in question, but in quiet acknowledgement. They had faced the storm side by side, and the cabin still stood. At the table that night, with coffee steaming in their mugs, Ethan reached across and set his hand lightly on hers. She turned her palm upward, letting their fingers intertwine. It was a simple gesture, unseen by the world, but to them it carried the weight of a vow. No matter the storms outside, they would carry them together. Healing was not an end, but a journey, and in that cabin they had chosen to walk it as one. The fire burned low, shadows dancing across the walls, and in that fragile quiet, Sa understood something new. She was no longer waiting for chains, no longer bracing for cruelty. She was living, breathing, healing, with a man who had never asked her to be less than whole. And as night folded around them, she knew that whatever came next, be it whispers from the town, the return of old threats, or the lingering ghosts of memory, she would not face it alone. The journey of trust had become the journey of love, and with each passing day it grew stronger, rooted deep in the soil of their shared silence. The storm that tested their roof had barely passed when another kind of storm came riding from the horizon. Two figures appeared on the ridge one late afternoon, horses kicking up dust that shimmered against the sinking sun. Ethan saw them first, his hand pausing over the fence rail he had been mending. His jaw tightened, though his body remained calm, still as stone. Sa, carrying a bucket from the well, followed his gaze and froze. One of the riders she knew, his face was burned into her memory. The ranch hand, bloated with whiskey and spite, the same who had once dragged her into the dirt, with rope biting at her wrists. The man beside him wore a badge dull with scratches, its metal less a mark of justice than a pretense of authority. The bucket slipped from her grasp, clattering against hard earth, spilling water into the dust. Her chest tightened, breath stuttering. It felt as though time had folded, dragging her back into the jeering crowd, her skin raw under coarse rope. But Ethan stepped forward without hesitation, placing himself between her and the riders, his hand resting near his belt, but not yet drawing. His stillness was its own weapon. The ranch hand spat into the dirt, his voice loud enough to sting. "You owe me, Cole. That woman wasn't yours to take. I want her back, or I want more coin." The deputy shifted uneasily, though his tone carried little weight. "There have been complaints about cattle gone missing, about women being kept against their will. I need to hear her say she's here by choice." His eyes flicked toward Sa, not unkind, but filled with the doubt of a man who trusted what others whispered more than what he saw. Sa's throat closed, her hands trembling at her sides. The memory of the rope was so sharp, she thought she could still feel it burning into her skin. Her voice faltered before it even rose. But then her eyes found Ethan's back, broad, unyielding, shielding her as if his very presence were a wall. Strength stirred in her chest, fragile but real. She stepped forward until her voice, though trembling, carried steady through the air. "I stay because I choose." The words left her like an arrow, cutting through fear, anchoring her to truth. For the first time since the trading yard, she spoke not to survive, but to claim her place. The deputy studied her, searching for cracks in her resolve, yet her gaze held, unwavering now. At last, he gave a single nod. "That's enough." He turned to the ranch hand. "You took money for her. That's the end of it. If you've got a complaint, take it to the judge, if you can spell your name." The ranch hand swore, fury twisting his face, but he knew better than to push further. With a yank on his reins, he wheeled his horse, spitting one last curse into the dirt before riding off. The deputy lingered a moment longer, tipping his hat toward Ethan and Sa. "Look after each other." Then he followed, his horse carrying him slow into the distance. Silence swallowed the yard once more. Sa realized her fists were clenched so tight, her nails had bitten crescents into her palms. Her breath left her in a shudder. Ethan turned then, his eyes meeting hers with steady weight. For once his words were more than a single sentence. "No one takes you from here. Not while I'm standing." Her throat tightened, not with fear this time, but with something deeper, steadier. She stepped forward, her forehead finding his chest, breath trembling against him. He did not pull her close, did not cage her, only stood solid as stone, letting her lean until her strength returned. The healing in that moment was not just safety, but belonging, the knowledge that she was no longer fighting alone. That night, in the glow of firelight, she sat at the table watching him sharpen his knife, the steady scrape a rhythm she had come to know. Her mind circled the truth. She had feared men would come, feared they would tear her back into chains. Yet when it happened, the world had seen her speak, had heard her claim her place. Ethan's presence had steadied her, but her voice had carried her. She realized then that healing was not just about what he gave her. It was about the strength she was beginning to reclaim within herself. Days that followed carried a different weight. Ethan's rifle leaned a little closer at the door, his watchfulness sharper. Sa found herself glancing at the ridge more often, half expecting riders to return, but they did not, and with every day they did not, her certainty grew. It was Ethan who finally spoke what lingered between them. One morning his voice carried plain across the quiet cabin. "We'll ride to the county seat. I want it on paper. No one can twist it then." His tone was steady, but the meaning beneath it was clear. The paper was not for him. It was for her. A promise that no man would drag her back with lies. Her heart swelled with something both fragile and fierce. She studied his face for a long moment before nodding. "I'll go." The next dawn carried them farther than any trail yet. 2 hours under the desert sun, dust rising behind their horses, silence weaving between them not as distance but as bond. Sar rode with her shawl tight, her shoulders squared, the blue dress she had sewn fitting her frame like proof of transformation. She thought then of the man beside her, scarred, quiet, haunted, and how he had chosen to carry her safety as his own. She thought, too, of the choice she was about to make, not forced, not bound, but freely given. When the county seat came into view, its courthouse rising plain but certain against the sky, she felt the knot in her chest shift. Fear was still there, but so was resolve. Together they dismounted and walked side by side through the doors into a future that would bear both their names. The clerk looked up over his spectacles, suspicion flickering for a moment before routine dulled it. Ethan's voice was steady, unyielding. "The woman beside me lives with me by choice. I want it written down clear." The clerk scratched pen to paper, sliding it across the desk. Ethan signed without hesitation, his name bold, practiced. Then came her turn. Sar's hand trembled as she took the pen, the weight of it heavier than the rope that had once bound her. Her fingers traced the letters of her name slowly, carefully, as though each stroke stitched her life back together. When she set the pen down, something settled inside her chest, firm as stone. The paper bore her name beside his. No one could claim her again without tearing through the law itself. As they stepped back into the sunlight, Ethan's hand brushed hers, not commanding, not demanding, only offering. She let her fingers linger in his. And in that touch lay the truth of what they were building. Not survival bound by fear, but a life chosen freely, a healing forged together. The journey was far from over. Yet with each step, the road ahead no longer felt like exile. It felt like belonging. And the desert wind, once a reminder of chains and dust, now carried the promise of a future they were shaping with their own hands. Spring softened the desert into something gentler, the air carrying the scent of damp earth after rare rain, the wash running fuller with snowmelt from distant peaks. The cabin, once a lonely outpost against the ridge, no longer looked like a solitary shelter. It had become a home lived in, a place where laughter sometimes threaded the silence, where blue cloth hung drying on the line, where cattle lowed softly in the corral. The garden Sar planted began to sprout, tender shoots of beans and squash breaking through soil turned by her own hands. Each green leaf was more than food. It was healing, proof that life could grow again in ground that had once seemed barren. Ethan watched her from the porch one morning, his scar catching the sun, his gaze lingering as she knelt in the dirt, her fingers smoothing earth over fragile stems. He realized then that solitude no longer claimed him. The silence of the desert, once heavy with ghosts, now pulsed with her presence. She had filled the spaces he thought would remain empty forever, not with noise, but with quiet belonging. He had not sought it, had not planned for it, but now he could not imagine the cabin without her voice humming by the fire, without her hand brushing his when setting plates on the table, without her eyes, dark, steady, carrying both pain and strength, meeting his in the glow of evening. The town still whispered when they came, eyes following them on the boardwalk, voices lowering behind hands. Men muttered that he had bought her, women shook their heads as though scandal clung like dust. But Sar no longer lowered her gaze. She stood tall, her blue dress fitted to her shoulders, the ring he had placed on her finger catching sunlight as she walked beside him. And over time, whispers dulled. Curiosity softened into quiet acknowledgement. People grew used to seeing them together, two figures once defined by scars now walking openly as equals. When the preacher spoke words over them in the small church, sunlight filtering through dusty windows, there was no jeering crowd, no cruel rope, only their voices, steady and clear. Ethan answered without pause, "I do." Sar's voice followed, strong, unwavering. "I do." Her name, once bartered in silence, now bound itself freely to his in front of the law, the church, and the watchful eyes of those who once doubted. No man could ever again claim her as property, not when she had spoken her vow in front of them all. She was wife, partner, equal. That night, after the vows were spoken and the townsfolk returned to their homes, Ethan and Sar sat together on the porch steps, mugs of coffee warming their hands. The ridge glowed gold under the last of the sun, the garden rustled with evening wind, and the cattle shifted in the corral. He reached for her hand, rough fingers closing gently around hers, and said what had lived in his chest since the day he first cut her rope. "We're family now." She leaned against him, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "We are." The desert night enfolded them, not in loneliness, but in peace. The woman who had once been sold for $2 was no longer bound by chains, no longer a shadow beneath jeers. She was Sakol, equal beside the man who had chosen not to look away. And Ethan, once a soldier burdened by ghosts and silence, was no longer alone. Together, they had woven a life not out of pity or debt, but out of choices made, day after day, stitch by stitch, breath by breath. Healing had not come in an instant. It had come in every shared meal, every silence that no longer felt empty, every night when fear gave way to trust. It had come in storms weathered side by side, in gardens planted, in the small touch of hands resting together in firelight. And now it bloomed in full, steady as the desert stars, certain as the sun rising each morning. If this story touched your heart, if you felt its warmth in the quiet moments of your own day, I invite you to share that light. Leave a like, write a comment, or subscribe so that we can continue walking together through stories that heal, that remind us of love's power to transform, that call us to see each other not as the world prices us, but as souls worth everything. Your presence here is part of this journey, and every word you share carries healing farther than either of us can see.